20 years ago, I helped start a band that was going to be the next big thing on a tiny indie record label out of Gainesville, Florida. 10 years later, Fueled By Ramen Records had set the music industry on fire, but our band had burned itself out. It was a cautionary tale of bad blood and missed opportunities, but music icons like Jack Antonoff took note of our influence on the scene.
I think that there's about 600 to 1,000 bands currently that owe their entire career to the stereo.
Alternative Press said we made one of the 10 most influential records of 1999, and members of incredibly successful multi-platinum acts like Fall Out Boy and Fun sang our praises. But most people have never even heard of us, so what happened? This is the story of the stereo. Hello and welcome to Kings of No Hope, the story of the stereo. I'm Rory Phillips. Over the run of this limited series, we'll share insight and interviews detailing a story of late 90s and early 2000s rock adventure. You'll hear what it's like to get into the room with all the key players and power brokers, but never quite be able to make it happen. How it feels to be a band that inspired many, but whose music was heard by few. In the end, we hope to share the lessons learned through a saga of loss and redemption. So why do I want to tell this story? I co-founded the stereo with Jamie Wilford in 1999 after my band The Impossibles and Jamie's band Animal Chin both decided to call it quits, but I wasn't always on the inside. The band's trials and tribulations, the not-so-behind-the-scenes drama, and their ability to fall short when they seemed destined for success, it always fascinated me. By all accounts, the stereo had the right pieces in place to not just make a run at rock stardom, but to actually get there. It all felt like it should have added up to something more, something undeniable. Now, many years later, I'm finally getting the opportunity to talk to those who were there about the why behind what happened and where it all went wrong. For an obscure pop rock band forged out of two lesser-known bands in the ska punk scene, the stereo ended up having an outsized influence on bands that many knew and loved. Here's Dashboard Confessional's Chris Carrabba talking about the stereo.
The stereo continues to be something I listen to with great frequency. As a matter of fact, I have a pre-show playlist, and it's like a 6-hour playlist. And I'd say there's 6 or 7 stereo songs on there. So there's a guarantee almost every night that before I go on stage, I have heard a stereo song, and it kind of gets in me and gets me super inspired. There's a lot of bands that have come since the stereo that were really inspired by what the stereo did as musicians, as lyricists, their vocal delivery, the really masterful recordings. I would say, like, for me, the most obvious popular band, and by popular I mean like truly like really famous band, that I think took a huge nod from the stereo on a lot of levels is Fall Out Boy.
Jamie was a huge influence on me, I would say, especially early on.
Lead singer of Fall Out Boy, Patrick Stump.
Because I was a drummer, first and foremost. I hadn't really ever tried to be anything else. And I assumed that was going to happen with Fall Out Boy, and somehow they liked me as a singer. And then I had the terrifying moment of like, oh God, I have to learn how to sing. Like suddenly, like on the job, I have to learn how to sing. And, the stereo was easily the most melodic thing I was listening to at that point. I think I was trying really hard to be a different kind of thing. I really admired, Hot Water Music and I don't know, Strike Anywhere and Kid Dynamite and that kind of stuff. But I wasn't that. Just because I admired that doesn't mean that's what I was. And I noticed that when I sang along with the stereo, I could really sing. And it was like I discovered my voice in a lot of ways, singing along to those records.
I've just always thought Jamie is an incredible writer, singer. To me, he kind of reminds me of like Paul McCartney. I know it sounds really big.
Ryan Seaman, drummer and co-founder of I Don't Know How, But They Found Me.
He's just so talented at everything. And I just feel like you guys should have been more known and more receptive, I don't know like what happened. And I don't mean that as like saying that disrespectfully. I mean like it boggles my mind how great you guys were live, and just it didn't go where I thought it should have gone.
I remember first hearing that record, and to be honest, to be fully honest, I was extremely jealous.
Chad Gilbert, guitarist and songwriter for Newfound Glory.
For a couple things. One, it was like, Newfound with Nothing Old Can Stay, I think we recorded that in 98, came out in 99, and doing our best to make a record. And then I heard the stereo record, and I was like, this sounds amazing. So first I was jealous of how awesome it sounded, because we would be in our tour van and listen to the CD. And then I was jealous because the songs were so good, and I was like, oh, I'll never be able to write a song that freaking catchy. Like, I just remember putting that album on and like from front to back, just wishing that I wrote some of those songs.
Telling this story also means we need to go back to a time before the stereo, the early days of Fueled by Ramen Records. Jamie and I were label mates on FBR back then, before Fueled by Ramen became one of the most successful labels in the industry. Here's Adam Samiljan, digital marketing director for Fueled by Ramen, and known to many simply as Adam FBR, talking about the label's trajectory.
In the late 90s, it was a small little punk rock label with a very eclectic roster of ska bands, hardcore bands, electronic bands. It was a bit all over the place in a really cool way. And then when I started there in 2001, kind of refined its sound a bit, became this home of this new generation of pop punk rock music. I didn't realize at the time how influential it was actually becoming, but throughout the 2000s and into the 2010s, it's amazing to look back and see all the bands that it helped launch, from Fall Out Boy, Panic at the Disco, I chime in with the haven't you people ever heard of closing a goddamn door, 21 Pilots, Paramore. It's amazing to see what the label has done. And a lot of those bands, I think, were inspired by the stereo. Anytime new band signed to the label, that was one that they were most excited about. The stereo was a band that they were excited to share a label with. I think you can look at a lot of the catalog on the label as before and after the stereo. I see them fitting in with a lot of the bands that came before them on the label, and also inspiring a ton of the bands that came afterwards.
I talked to Stereo co-founder Jamie Wolford about his introduction to FBR, and how it all started when he sent a tape of Animal Chin to Mike Park, leader of Skank and Pickle and founder of Asian Man Records.
I don't even think it was Asian Man back then. I think it was Dill Records. Mike Park was from Skank and Pickle, and they were, sort of the big ska punk band at the time. I remember there was that Dill tour, I think, which was headlining was Skank and Pickle, main support was Less Than Jake, and the opener was No Doubt. But anyway, so we sent it to Mike, and we liked Mike, and we liked his label and what he was doing, and we were like, oh, if we could get on this label. But I think Mike showed the cassette to Vinnie from Less Than Jake.
I was driving around in a van with Less Than Jake, and this was in the mid-90s.
Vinnie Fiorello, drummer and lyricist for Less Than Jake and co-founder of Fueled by Ramen Records.
We would play with all kinds of bands, right? And sometimes a friend of a friend would be, hey, here's this demo tape. And that became a staple in the van. Anytime that I would have the ability to listen to what I chose, I would choose the Animal Chin songs.
And all of a sudden, one day I get a voicemail from some guy named John Janik.
John Janik was a student at the University of Florida who started Fueled by Ramen with Vinnie from Less Than Jake, primarily as a way to release Less Than Jake vinyl stuff. And then it became a way to help out some of the bands that Less Than Jake would discover on tour. When I got introduced to the label, it was definitely in my mind as Less Than Jake's label. And then starting to intern there and meeting John, I realized just how much he had contributed to it and how much he was really in the day-to-day of everything that the label was doing.
He called me and we talked for a long time on the phone about doing a record for Animal Chin, and re-released our Ins and Outs of Terrorism cassette as a CD EP with Fueled by Ramen.
And then I did a podcast recently, and someone asked me, what was your favorite Fueled by Ramen release? And I went, you know what? I'm going to tell you not necessarily my favorite one, but the one that I listened to most. And that was the Impossibles tape. And I listened to that thing into the ground.
It doesn't matter now what I should have done then. My heart was in the right place at the wrong time again.
I listened to that thing on overnight drives, and I listened to that thing while we were cutting our teeth at weird clubs along the way and into bigger venues. And then those two releases, defined what I thought ska punk music was at the time. It wasn't Real Big Fish, and it wasn't Less Than Jake. I thought the future of what it could be as a musical genre, as this wave that was coming in, I thought it was the Impossibles, and I thought it was Animal Chin.
I don't know how this doesn't get talked about all that much, but I was an obsessive ska kid.
Patrick Stump.
And so I had followed Animal Chin and the Impossibles. And, so naturally it's kind of, what's their next band, But again, I was still kind of in this, when you're 15 and you're like, no, man, I don't know. At that point I was getting really into hardcore, and I didn't want to admit that I liked, things that I could sing along to. And then a good friend of mine in hardcore bands was like, dude, you can like it. You do. You can admit that you like it. It's like, I like it. and so I kind of did, I just kind of dove in head first, and, and I really ate those records up.
And then, Animal Chin broke up, and the Impossibles broke up, and I had heard from John Janik, who, owned the label with me, and he said, hey, the stereo is going to happen, this thing. And he explained to me what it was. And I thought about it. Hey, I'm going to love this because it's two of my favorite songwriters. When I listened to it, it was this, just ultra pure pop hooks.
If you have a moment to spare for me, if you need a friend that I will be, if you need some company, then call me.
And I could tell the fingerprints of each one of the songwriters on it. And while it was surprising when I first listened to it, I could tell, hey, this is some of the stuff that Rory wrote, and here's the stuff that Jamie did. And it was this awesome mash of both of your talents together.
Jamie wasn't just on the label. He was working hard behind the scenes too, creating the majority of the early FBR aesthetic.
For Fueled by Ramen, it was always a major part of it.
Adam Samiljan.
I think that was something that separated it from a lot of other labels where artwork at times seemed to be just thrown together last minute, or it seemed to be an afterthought. Working with somebody like Jamie on the releases and the artwork and the logo and the design, I think he was able to add a level of professionalism, a level of focus and intention that was something that really elevated it and made it stand out in my mind among other labels.
I was sort of on retainer, I guess, a salary, I guess, to just sort of, John's like, we're going to be doing this many CDs a month. We're going to be doing posters. We're going to be doing one sheets. We're going to do stickers. We're going to be doing T-shirts. Everything they needed, even if it was just like sound scan sheets and stuff like that, I would just, just open up Quark Express, what I was using at the time, and I would just make these things, I was just present. Even though I didn't live in Florida, I feel like I was pretty present back then. That Fueled by Ramen book that came out, John speaks so highly of you and I in that. And I almost feel like he even says we helped shape the record label in those days.
In the 2011 book, 15 Years of Fueled by Ramen, John wrote, among the first bands we signed were the Impossibles and Animal Chin, two very important artists that helped build the foundation of Fueled by Ramen. Not only were these bands successful, at least by our standards at the time, but Jamie Wolford of Animal Chin and the Impossibles' Rory Phillips also became friends to everyone at FBR and helped us build the young label. Jamie did a lot of FBR's design, and Rory produced some of the albums and introduced us to Recover as well. When both of their bands broke up, I brought the two together to form The Stereo. Their debut album, 300, became a very influential release in our small underground scene. I remember the first time I called the Fall Out Boy apartment where Pete Wentz, Joe Troman, and Patrick Stump lived. When I spoke to Patrick, the first artist he brought up when we talked about music was The Stereo.
Over the years, John has always been at the head of the label, building Fueled by Ramen into this massive worldwide label. became part of the Warner Music Group, partnered with Atlantic Records, continued to grow from there. John then became the co-head of Elektra Records in addition to his role at Fueled by Ramen. And then in 2012, he was tapped by Jimmy Iovine to be Jimmy's replacement at Interscope Records.
He was the engine room to that ship by far. I mean, look, there's no doubt that this stuff is sort of based on luck, but you got to remember, this guy is now in charge of like half of music. It's ridiculous, right? He replaced Jimmy Iovine, right? This is the guy that signed our shitty bands. He obviously had a knack for doing this. I mean, even then, he just was like nailing it.
We're about to meet the next key player in the stereo story, but it took Jamie getting left high and dry by a new drummer for Animal Chin before Jeremy Tapero would enter the picture.
So I drove out to New Jersey, packed up this dude, brought him back. 2 days later, we get there and we're practicing. He quits and leaves and goes back to Jersey. We have a tour a week and a half later. I'm like, oh, this sucks. So I scramble and we hear about this guy, Jeremy Tapero. And at the time, he's in a band called Smitty from Madison, Wisconsin. He's young. He's 17.
I was still in high school. I had to convince my dad that I could play in a band from Minneapolis, which was 4 hours away from Madison, and still finish high school, which ultimately I was incorrect about.
So he's kind of in the van, learning parts, whatever. We're touring with MB330.
A guy named Steve Ozark had 1 million shows lined up for us, and yeah, it was like, I jumped into Animal, just like from going on my very first tour ever with the Siren 6, which was maybe 2 weeks long, to like, I think we left right away for like 2 months.
We come home, we spend a week to make, not even a week, like 5 days to make All the Kids Agree, and then we go out again.
And somehow didn't ever get like more than 700 miles away from home, but we're on the road for 2 months,
You're on the circuit.
Every Midwestern weird spot, yeah.
My guess is we met up with you guys after that, just because of how fast things were moving.
Let's go back to that fateful meeting. Animal Chin and the Impossibles were playing a pizza place in Indianapolis, Indiana. We had the same booking agent, and he liked to book us in weird Midwestern venues for 10 people. And this venue was no exception.
I remember coming into that show. By the way, I'd already heard about your band, The Impossibles, from everyone. And they're like Weezer, but ska. They're the greatest thing in the world. And I'm just like, okay, wow. And like, I was just so excited to finally see you guys and like meet you. And I remember, I feel like we instantly became fast friends.
And I definitely remember we felt the camaraderie and the fact that we were both technically ska bands, but I think we all kind of hated ska at that point. Or, you know what I mean? Yeah. We were ska bands, but we weren't ska bands. We're like, I don't know. We immediately were like, we should like play more shows with these guys. They're doing something more similar to what we're doing than playing with, Johnny Sacco or whoever it was at the time.
And I got your record that night and I listened to it later and it was just, this is where we need to be going. You know what I mean? Because we were so interested in being like good, like loud and tight and fierce, that I don't think I was putting enough attention on songwriting. It was more about kind of almost like band writing, if I could say it that way. I kind of wanted it to be the descendants of ska, or the Propaganda or No Effects of ska.
It's so funny that you talk about them, because that's exactly all of my real early memories. You guys had some political slants to your songs, and then the aggression and Propaganda. I mean, I was a huge Propaganda fan, so you just hit the sweet spot. It was like, wow, this is a band that we're playing and touring with who have this vibe that is totally what I'm in love with right now.
Right.
I loved the songs and still do. Like re-listening to Ins and Outs of Terrorism. Those are classics. I love them.
I think we even would describe ourselves as political punk ska or political skate punk ska or something like that. We were all like vegan and vegetarian, and we were, at the time, I think we were all trying to rock the straight edge thing and, all the X's on the hands and all that stuff. We were literally trying to incorporate every aspect of scene that we could. But that was our slant. That was our theme, our motif, whatever. But then I saw you guys and I just remember being like, you had melody that was better than anybody else's melody at the time. You know, this is, we're doing it all wrong. You know, I kind of had like I've seen the future. We need to do this. I think it leveled us up, or at least gave us a new target, or gave me a new target, at least songwriting wise. The next stuff that I have to write has to tug at the heartstrings more than this other stuff does. You can't just do it through fierce intensity. You know, that's one emotion.
The creative pull of new influences and Jamie wanting to focus on melody might have made it seem like the writing was on the wall for Animal Chin. But it would take a blowout in Colorado to bring that band to an end. I talked to BJ Willett, Animal Chin's last drummer and a key part of our story, about the end of their last tour.
The tour itself was, for our band at that time, was pretty challenging. You know, we had some pretty tough shows. I think it was trying on everybody. That was one of those tours where I kind of spent a lot more time, you know, hanging out with the people in the other band than I did my own band. And I think that was the beginning of sort of a falling out with, like, especially Jamie and I.
Our last show was in Colorado Springs, Colorado. We actually showed up and this club was completely ill-equipped to have a show for us.
It was a breaking point. You've been in a band with Jamie, and I think we all knew at that time in his life he could be a little pushy from the stage.
We played and we actually, like, the whole show got shut down because of volume.
It was just a little too much to take in regards to, like, the crowd and the show for me. And, you know, my sister was there. My sister was one of the very few people that were actually at that show. So I was just really embarrassed and kind of fed up. And yeah, we had a very bad night.
I only think we played 3 songs. And BJ and I got into kind of like, not a physical altercation, but it definitely could have gone there.
You know, punches were thrown.
All the things that had been going on at this point just kind of went in that moment. And we both got actually ejected from our own show.
And the next day I got in the van with the Eclectics and just went to Chicago, and Andy and Jamie drove home by themselves. And that was, I mean, aside from one more show that we played, that was the end of Animal Chin.
I immediately was like, that's it. I'm going to do something on my own or something. I'm the guy that I contact the label every day. I'm driving, I'm doing this, I'm writing songs, whatever. Like, I'm just going to make my own record, you know? And John at FBR will put it out.
Jamie had a plan to set out on his own. Meanwhile, my band, The Impossibles, had fallen apart, unable to withstand the pressures brought on by impending adulthood. We were 2 frontmen trying to stay in the game and racing towards our next endeavor. Jamie's clear vision of what the next step should look like meant that he'd be taking the lead.
So I made this demo, and I think it was 8 songs, where I played every instrument, and I sent it to John. I was like, hey, what do you think about this? Would you put this out? Just me. And like, I'll do it again, but here's what I'm working on. And he was like, this is crazy good. Well, Rory has all these songs too, and like, he's going to do a solo record. You're going to do a solo record. You guys should just do a Hall & Oates kind of thing.
I don't think that I ever talked to John about doing a solo record. I mean, I think I kept trying to start bands and join bands, and like, I just really wanted to keep being in a band. The rest of the guys in The Impossibles had kind of pulled the plug, and it wasn't so much like, you know, are we going to have 2 dueling solo records, as much as I did have some songs that I had already written and that were, and really, when you put them all together, and obviously they ended up on a record together, I think we were on similar tracks. And I think that he could just see that. Like, this would just make more sense if we added it together.
I mean, it was the indie version of the record label guy going, hey, why don't you guys do a record together?
Yeah,
in some sense, it was a strange boy band origin, you know?
John Janik had brought us together, but 1,200 miles still separated us. Luckily, even in a time before the internet, we found a way to make that long-distance relationship work.
I literally think we had one phone call. I'm not even joking. And it was like the night before I left. And I drove 16 hours from Minneapolis to Austin by myself in the van with a bunch of gear and whatever. And then the very next day, we sort of got set up. But every day, we would just sort of work something out. Like, okay, let's write some music. But we just spent 2 weeks and the whole kind of concept for the band, the name, the songs, everything kind of came together. And I remember like the day before we left, we printed the mixes.
Part of my memory of that was us specifically talking about not using a band name that started with S. There was some like version where it was like, there's too many bands that start with the letter S. I want to say that we maybe even talked about not using the something, and then we sat down and hashed it out and ended up with the Stereo.
That worked. Oops. I mean, I remember we had some really bad ones. I remember this is embarrassing, but Mathematica was a choice. I remember we have Those Who Can or something like that. I remember Curse Those Handsome Devils, which I liked. I like now too. I kind of like, in some ways I'm like, that would have been fun to call ourselves that. And I don't know if it was you or me that came up with Stereo, because it was just Stereo and we added the. But we were talking about how on the demo, my guitar was in the left channel and yours was in the right channel. Like it's the stereo. It's this balance of you and me separated but together sort of thing, like stereo channels in a mix or something like that. I don't exactly remember our reasoning or our verbiage or anything like that, but we're like, what about stereo? And I think I said, well, what about the stereo? And then it just sounded so, I remember feeling like that sounds important, but as soon as we finished the meal, we went to a record store that was on the way back to your place. We popped in, we're like, you guys have anything by the Stereo? And he's like, oh, no, let me look it up. And he looked it up. He's like, there's no listing for the Stereo. And then we were like, okay, we're called the Stereo.
We had the songs, we had the name, and in the next chapter, it'll be time to trek from Austin back to Minneapolis and record the debut album, 300. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. In future episodes, Jamie's going to be able to tell me where the band went, what they accomplished, what seemed to hold them back when success kept feeling like it was right around the corner. Because there's one part of the story that I haven't mentioned yet. I'm about to get kicked out of this band.
And I'll tell you the exact moment that I was going to throw you into a ditch.
That's next time on The Story of the Stereo. Kings of No Hope is written and produced by me, Rory Phillips. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at RoryATX. The Stereo are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at The Stereo Rock. You can listen to The Stereo on Spotify, Apple Music, or use CDs buried at the bottom of your local record store's cutout bin.